Okay, so it's 4 o'clock and we'll start this session. This is, I'm Stephanie Seneff. I'm from MIT, CSAIL, senior research scientist there, and I'm going to be talking about the role of aluminum and glyphosate, synergistic role in autism. So you all know this frightening trend. This is autism diagnoses by the CDC. It's going up and up and up. Where is it going in the future? I predict by 2025, half the kids born will be diagnosed with autism. That's not going to be an easy situation for the country to face and for the country's future. So, people keep saying, oh yeah, it's genetic. Autism is a genetic disease. They're not spending the money they should be spending looking for environmental factors. And, when you say as much as you could try to think of increased diagnosis or whatever, you've still got a huge part that's unexplained, unclear, and that is almost surely environmental. I don't think this audience would disagree. So I've been studying autism for about 7 years now, reading extensively in the literature and looking one by one at all the different environmental toxins and all the factors that might be, environmental factors that might be involved in autism. And I've identified several. Certainly insufficient sunlight exposure to both the skin and the eyes was something I identified early on. People in northern latitudes have increased risk to autism, for example. And poor diet is something I think people are aware of, deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies. Vaccines is something this community is very familiar with. But there's another factor that I didn't recognize until about 2 years ago. I went to hear a talk by Don Huber. He's a professor, retired professor from Purdue, expert on plant physiology and plant pathology. He's been going around the world talking about the dangers of this Roundup and it's in the damage that it's doing to our nation's health. And once I heard his lecture, I became a changed person, and I've spent really all of my time since then studying this chemical and understanding how it works biologically and linking that to very many diseases and conditions that are plaguing us today. Things like diabetes and Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, various cancers. And you can see a very strong connection between this chemical and those diseases. And Roundup is so familiar, like aluminum. It's so much in our environment we consider it to be safe. We don't think about it. We don't think it could possibly be toxic. I hope that I will convince all of you, and I wish there were more of you, by the end of this talk that you need to go home and do the same thing I did. Devote as much of your spare time as you can to telling other people about this problem that we face in our environment. So here's an outline of what's coming. It's a 2-hour talk. I'll be exhausted by the end of it. First, introduce the glyphosate and autism. Then talking about the synergistic effects of aluminum and glyphosate and their connection to the pineal gland disruption, and in particular sulfate disruption. Sulfate is an interesting molecule that I have more to say about later. I early on identified sulfate deficiency as a key factor in autism and in many other modern diseases. And I can explain the sulfate deficiency through the glyphosate and the aluminum, and also mercury. So synergistic effects of those two, and how sunlight deficiency also plays a role, causes deficiencies in melatonin and sulfate, which is very important to the brain. Digestive system disorders, you've heard a lot about that. I'll say more, and I will say it in the connection of glyphosate. Infertility and birth defects, again relating to the glyphosate. Glyphosate chelates manganese, and this is something I only appreciated recently. Once I started looking at that, I found many factors that I was aware of in autism could be easily explained simply by manganese deficiency. So I'll go into all of those, and then I'll give you some hints about how to keep yourself and your family safe. So glyphosate and autism. This is a stunning graph. I don't know how many of you have seen this graph. Yeah, a few? Good. This is a plot of the bars are the rate of autism diagnosis in the U.S. school system, the public school system. They get on the disability program because of this diagnosis. And this is over time from 1990 on the left to 2010 on the right. And the red is the amount of Roundup used on corn and soy crops in the U.S. Now, of course, corn and soy crops are now 90% GMO engineered to be Roundup ready. That means when you spray Roundup on the crop, it doesn't die. In fact, it soaks it up and gets it into the food chain. And we're not even bothering to measure, for the most part, how much is getting into our food, because it's considered to be safe. And so it's going up. The use of Roundup on these crops, as you can see, is rising dramatically in the last few years. That's because we're producing Roundup-ready weeds. So the weeds that are growing among these Roundup-ready crops are not dying as easily as they used to. So the solution is simply to add more Roundup, and that's what's happening. And I think that the fact that it fits so well with the autism is very suspicious. So U.S. consumes 25% of the world's market of Roundup, and we certainly don't have 25% of the world's population. So you do the math. We're getting a lot more exposure than other nations, and that's reflected in our high autism rates. So is glyphosate toxic? Monsanto assures us that it's not. It disrupts a pathway called the shikimate pathway. And that pathway produces products called the aromatic amino acids in the plants. And when the plants can't produce those products, they die. Well, it turns out our gut bacteria also have the shikimate pathway. So our cells don't. They're right about that. But because we don't have that pathway, we can't make that product. So we depend on our food and on our gut bacteria to supply us with these aromatic amino acids that are produced by this pathway that glyphosate disrupts. Now, glyphosate is one of the ingredients in Roundup, but Roundup has other ingredients too. Just like the vaccines have adjuvants, Roundup also has adjuvants. These are extra things that are put in to make it much more toxic, to make the glyphosate much more toxic to the plants than it would otherwise be. But that also makes the glyphosate much more toxic to us. And people have shown a dramatic increase in the toxicity of Roundup compared to glyphosate acting alone. And then the other thing is that the effects are insidious. So if you're exposed to a small amount of glyphosate in your food, you won't necessarily notice anything when you eat that food. But over time, your health will get eroded slowly, and then you'll become sick much earlier than you should be. You'll sort of enter an old age stage, in a sense, by getting these various diseases that are going to cause you a lot of problems. And so the studies that are done to show that Roundup is safe on animals are restricted to only 3 months. And there was only one study that went for the entire lifetime of the rats, which was done by Professor Seralini in France. And that study showed tremendous toxicity to the liver, to the kidney. They had huge mammary tumors in these rats, and it went for the whole lifetime. The industry fought back, and eventually that paper a year later was retracted. And many people are very upset about that because it was retracted on completely illegitimate grounds, which is simply that the data weren't necessarily quite statistically significant. There should have been more rats. But in fact, all the other studies that were only 3 months long also had a very small number of rats and didn't show an effect. And it's fine. Those are not retracted. So in fact, we haven't really done any experiments to see if Roundup is toxic in rats because this one that we did was rejected. I think that's amazing when we have a product that is used so much in the world on our food that we're not bothering to even see if it's toxic. So these are the main toxic effects. I mentioned the gut bacteria disrupts the gut bacteria by virtue of disrupting this shikimate pathway. There's other reasons as well. And it's been shown in animal studies that glyphosate causes the good bacteria, the beneficial bacteria, it stresses them more than it does the pathogens. So it allows the pathogens to gain a foothold, and they overgrow and they release toxic chemicals that will disrupt your health. It interferes with a class of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes, CYP enzymes for short. And as you'll see in a moment, these enzymes have also many roles in the liver. In particular, they activate vitamin D. They control the bile acid production. They detoxify other toxic chemicals, so it's very, very important. It chelates important minerals such as iron, cobalt, and manganese. And I mentioned manganese earlier. It interferes with the synthesis of these aromatic amino acids. And those aromatic amino acids are precursors to all kinds of important neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and melatonin and melanin and thyroid hormone and folate. I mean, all of those things that are screwed up, and all autism depend upon these aromatic amino acids. It disrupts sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport. Sulfate was the thing that I identified early on as a problem in autism. So eventually the adjuvants, this is a paper, and they say that the adjuvants that are in these pesticides can increase the activity of the active ingredient by up to 1,000-fold, the toxicity of the active ingredient. And this was in 100% of the cases where they were indicated to be present in the by the manufacturer. Here's a paper that studied Roundup and a whole bunch of other herbicides and pesticides. And I'll just quote them. It's commonly believed that Roundup is among the safest pesticides. Despite its reputation, Roundup was by far the most toxic among the herbicides and insecticides that were tested. And this inconsistency between scientific fact and industrial claim may be attributed to huge economic interests, which have been found to falsify health risk assessments and delay health policy decisions. So that's what we're facing right now. This is a big moneymaker. People don't know how to go back to growing crops without using all these weed killers. So they're afraid to face the facts about this toxic chemical. Okay, so it's toxic. Are we exposed? That's the question we want to answer, right? And again, there's very little data. However, there's an initiative launched by Zen Honeycutt, a mother of a child who was having behavioral difficulties. She put him on an organic diet and he straightened up. And then she started looking into it and she found stuff that made her very worried. She took the initiative to get her friends to send in their breast milk and their urine for tests. And these were people who were being conscientious about avoiding GMOs. And she found that something like 30% of them tested positive for glyphosate in the urine or in the breast milk. And the breast milk levels were at 760 to 1,600 times higher than the level that's allowed in European drinking water. And the urine tests also showed high levels that were 10 times as high as the levels that were seen in a similar experiment in Europe. And so she's arguing that Monsanto, who claims that it doesn't bioaccumulate, she's saying maybe you're wrong about that. Here's a study recently published, 2014, looking at 3 different kinds of soy. We have the organic soy on the left, the conventional soy in the middle, and on the right is a GM Roundup Ready soy. And the axis on the y-axis is glyphosate and AMPA. AMPA is a breakdown product of glyphosate, and so the combination really represents the amount of toxicity in the original glyphosate coming in. And as you can see, only the GMO soy actually had any glyphosate in it. So here's some levels. What do those levels mean? Well, Monsanto itself claimed that a level of 5.6 milligrams per kilogram would be an extremely high level. This is 5.6. So you've got 70% of these samples coming over an extremely high level, according to Monsanto, in these GM soy crops. The problem is that this is happening very recently because of the increased use of the Roundup on the GM soy, and nobody's been paying attention. So soy formula, as you might guess, is linked to seizures and autism. They had a 2.6-fold higher rate of febrile seizures, 2.1-fold higher rate of epilepsy comorbidity, 4-fold higher rate of simple partial seizures in these autistic children who were fed soy-based formula. And the soy-based formula is very likely to be GMO. 90% of the crop is. We don't have any GMO labeling, so you can't find out whether it is or not when you buy it. So there's all these biomarkers for autism that I had accumulated in my studies. And what was very exciting when I heard Dr. Huber's talk is that all of a sudden I could explain them all. And so the disrupted gut bacteria, we've already talked about that, and the inflammatory bowel, that's glyphosate really messes up the gut bacteria, and glyphosate disrupts the sulfate, both sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport. Glyphosate has been shown to deplete methionine. Serotonin and melatonin are products of the shikimate pathway. Aromatase is a cytochrome P450 enzyme. Zinc and iron are minerals that are known to be chelated by glyphosate, which prevents their uptake. P-cresol is a product of a overgrown pathogen in the gut that's known to be increased by glyphosate. And these last two, mitochondrial disorder and glutamate toxicity, are related to manganese deficiency, which is also a chelation problem from glyphosate. So basically, these can all be explained as potential effects of glyphosate on biological systems. Okay, so this is does that come out okay? This is just a paper that shows the microbiology of regressive autism, and it's showing sort of immunological susceptibility at the top, antimicrobials, environmental influences, diet on the right, coming into disrupted gut bacteria. So glyphosate is actually a patented antimicrobial agent. It's been patented as an antibiotic. So when you're getting glyphosate in your food, you're chronically eating antibiotics. That's going to cause overgrowth of bacteria such as this desulfovibrio. This is a bacterium in the gut that reduces sulfate to hydrogen sulfide gas. So that's going to deplete your sulfate. And so then you have these toxins that get produced by these bacteria such as endotoxin, which then stimulates an immune response, and that generates nitric oxide, which then also feeds desulfovibrio because they can oxidize nitrogen as well as sulfur. So you get a kind of a chronic feedback loop that encourages these bacteria to grow. And that's the nitrate, yeah. And so here's a paper that just came out, 2013, December, which was a great paper, Probiotics to Treat Mouse Autism. Now, you guys all know about probiotics treating autism. And so this is a picture from that paper. And so basically the probiotics allow you to bring back those beneficial bacteria that were getting killed by the glyphosate. And in particular, a metabolite of C. difficile is picresol, which is a toxic phenol that can cause kidney damage. And so this is produced by this bacterium that has been shown to overgrow in the gut in animal studies. And then it's also been found in the urine of autistic kids. So here's another plot, glyphosate usage on corn and soy again. And of course, corn and soy is the base of the processed food industry. And the other, the yellow boxes this time are deaths per 100,000 due to dementia, senile dementia. So I believe that basically autism and Alzheimer's dementia are the same condition. Really, they're the same pathology in two different age groups and manifested in two different age groups. Both of them are going up astronomically in recent years, and I think both of them are due in part, if not in large part, to exposure to Roundup. So aluminum, glyphosate, sulfate in the pineal gland. A lot of topics here. It's a very fascinating topic that I got into. And as I dug deeper, it became more and more interesting. So I'm going to try to tell this story to you, hopefully at a level you'll be able to understand. I know biology is difficult, but you guys are probably better informed than most people because you've really been in it deep with your children. So here we go. This is a hypothesis of mine. And this is a hypothesis I had before I discovered the glyphosate connection. Many neurological diseases of the brain have a common origin, which is insufficient supply of sulfate to the brain. And so you have these toxic metals, such as aluminum and mercury, which become more toxic because you don't have enough sulfate and you can't detoxify them. And of course, it's generally sulfur in general, but in particular, sulfate, I think, is a key part. Sulfate is, I'll get to this later, but sulfate is an oxidized form of sulfur. It's sulfur plus 4 oxygen atoms, and it has a -2 charge. It's an extremely interesting anion, it's called, that has many roles in the body. So the toxic metals interfere with the synthesis of sulfate, and when you don't have enough sulfate, you can't get rid of them. So that's another circular effect that's going to cause damage that you can't, kind of out of control feedback loop. And so critically, this results in the brain, and everywhere actually, in an accumulation of cellular debris that you can't get rid of because the sulfate is needed to break down the busted molecules. And the molecules are busted because of exposure to things like sugar and oxygen, which cause glycation and oxidation damage. So you get these broken proteins, broken fats, and they're just going to accumulate and cause trouble and get in the way of your biological functions if you can't dispose of them. You sort of build up the garbage. And the sulfate is what you need to be able to clear the garbage. So here's another picture, glyphosate, usage on corn and soy. You saw this before. That's the blue. The red is the children with autism, just drawn as a line instead of the boxes. Now the yellow is the simple raw count of the number of reports in the VAERS database, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. The raw number of counts of how many reports were there that year, starting from 1990 going to 2010. What's remarkable is that the number of reports in the VAERS is going up in step with glyphosate usage on corn and soy. Now that seems like a total disconnect. Like you could say, well, maybe that is a case of just correlation, doesn't necessarily mean causation. But I can find a reason why there would be causation in this case. And that's because glyphosate synergistically makes aluminum and mercury much more toxic than they would otherwise be. And so the vaccines are more problematic. More kids are reacting to them because they've got this additional poison in their environment. So I think that's a way that makes this plot make sense. So we all know that everywhere is telling you to be sure to get your flu shot. And I find this very, very annoying. I have never had a flu shot in my life. I can't remember the last time I had the flu. It's been at least 15, 20 years. I don't think people should be getting these flu shots. They often have, some of them have mercury, I think about 50%. And they're telling pregnant women to get their flu shot, which I find very shocking, because we all know that mercury is a very dangerous toxic heavy metal causal in autism. So this is a paper that came out very recently, and I think Mark Geyer has been here and talking in front of this audience. And this is his paper with a bunch of other authors, and it's a great paper on thimerosal. And the interesting thing is the role of sulfation chemistry and thiol availability in autism. So he's linking the thimerosal, which is the mercury, to impaired sulfate. So both not having enough sulfate to get rid of the mercury and having the mercury mess up your ability to make the sulfate. Another one of those feedback loops that's going to be really deadly. So here's from his... Okay, so he says several studies suggest that children diagnosed with autism have abnormal sulfation chemistry. I certainly had seen that before I was looking at the glyphosate. Limited thiol availability, that means limited availability of sulfur. Thiol is a term for sulfur. And decreased glutathione, and you guys have heard about glutathione reserve capacity. That's this high ratio of oxidized to reduced glutathione. And then, a compromised oxidation reduction and detoxification capacity. So that's a lot of words there, but I think you guys have all been hearing this message in this if you've been attending these talks. And so this is a really key feature of mercury that they pointed out in this paper. Molybdenum is another one of these critical rare minerals that are essential to health. And molybdopterin is a protein that depends upon molybdenum to work. So what this molybdopterin does is that it oxidizes sulfite to sulfate. And so if you have mercury in the way, it will displace the molybdenum and cause that molecule not to work. And the result will be too much sulfite and too little sulfate. That makes sense, right? Well, it turns out sulfite is toxic and sulfate is essential to health. So here you've got already, just from this one molecule, a major disruption in your sulfate synthesis pathway. And so children, which was really surprising to me from this paper, I didn't know this until I read this paper, with autism whose symptoms manifested after 15 months of age had a 50-fold increase in serum sulfite. And that is really an incredible number, which really does point to some disruption of the sulfite oxidase of the molybdopterin, and they can't get the sulfite to the sulfate. And that might be why I hear about people who cannot handle sulfur-containing foods like broccoli and garlic. It makes them sick, and it's probably because this enzyme is not working. Or it could also be because they've got too much desulfovibrio producing hydrogen sulfide gas. So there's different ways you can be screwed up so that you can't just take sulfur supplements. You have to be very careful. Okay, so sleep, and I'm sure you all know sleep is really important. And this paper, which was from 2013, argued that a crucial role for sleep is to clear this cellular debris that I was telling you about that builds up when you can't clear it. And so this clearing takes place in the lysosome, which is like the cell's digestive system, and it depends upon sulfate and heparan sulfate proteoglycans to protect it from free radicals. So the sulfate makes clearing the debris safe. Otherwise, you're going to have to cause all these free radicals, which are going to cause oxidative damage to the cell in the process of clearing your garbage. And so now my proposal here is that melatonin plays a critical role in supplying the sulfate to the brain. So this is coming. I'll get to that story a little bit later. But first I want to talk about heparin. Heparin is a wonderful molecule. Does anyone here know heparin? It's the most highly sulfated molecule known to biology. And you can see here, this guy is a sulfate, and you can see, if you look at the picture, all the other sulfates on that molecule, there's a lot of them. All those guys are sulfates with the S's and the O's around them. So this is an amazing molecule. And this paper explains really, really important feature of heparin here, which is that it can allow iron. So iron is a very dangerous, it's a very important molecule for reactions, but also very dangerous because it can release this superoxide, which is this guy over here on the right, O2 minus. That's a superoxide that causes all this oxidative damage. And when iron reacts with oxygen, it can produce superoxide. However, if you can keep it in an acidic environment, a low pH, then it will produce water instead. So water is harmless, superoxide is extremely dangerous, and heparin can make it turn to water rather than superoxide. A very important point. And so the heparin sulfate is a molecule that's very, very similar to heparin, and it's found in all the cells around the outside of the cell. They have these things called heparin sulfate proteoglycans, kind of a big word, HSPGs, that are decorating the outside of the cell and that have very important roles in the cell, both in terms of bringing in nutrients and transport of ions and all kinds of things, as well as supplying the sulfate, which can allow the cell to digest things. Really, really important. So this was a paper that talked about an experiment with designer mice, which were designed, and they can do all these really cool engineering designs on these mice. And they made these mice specifically unable to make heparin sulfate only in the brain. Everywhere else in the body it was fine, but in the brain they couldn't make the heparin sulfate. And they found that these mice exhibited all of the mouse features of autism, all the various mouse mappings of autistic features were seen in these mice who couldn't make heparin sulfate. So now getting into the sleep disorder in the pineal gland, as you probably know, sleep disorder is linked to many neurological diseases. Probably a lot of you have children who have issues with sleep, right? I don't know if I can see a show of hands. Yeah, a few of you. So autism, Alzheimer's, depression, schizophrenia, ALS, Parkinson's disease, these have all been shown to be connected to sleep disorder. And I looked at the VARS database. I've looked at the VARS database in a lot of different ways. I'm a computer scientist, so I can sort of analyze data. And I just did a look at vaccines that contained aluminum versus ones that didn't. So looking at all the reactions for these different groups, and sampled so that it was completely similar, exactly the same age distribution of the two sets. And then you can see what's the probability of sleep disorder being reported in these two sets. And you find that there's a very highly significant bias towards the ones that contain aluminum. P equals 0.0025, highly significant. That people reported sleep disorder much more often in association with aluminum-containing vaccines. So that clearly points to aluminum as being a factor in the sleep disorder. Now, the pineal gland is interesting. The pineal gland is a little bitty gland right in the center of the brain. It's been called the seat of the soul. And it sits right behind the eyes, so it picks up sunlight. There's a lot of interesting things about this gland. And it's very heavily perfused. It's actually like the kidney. You might say it's sort of the kidney of the brain because it's pulling in the blood. It's a terminal watershed of the blood, just like the kidney is. It has very highly perfused. And it's going to sort of be delivering stuff into the cerebrospinal fluid, which is equivalent to the urine. So there's like this transfer from one liquid medium to another of materials between that the pineal gland is helping to orchestrate. And it's susceptible to aluminum toxicity because of being outside the blood-brain barrier. So this is an example of another data analysis I did from the VARS database. I was looking at the aluminum and the mercury in the vaccines. I used a formula which is shown below where I'm counting the total burden of aluminum, not just the number of vaccines, but exactly how much aluminum is in each one of those shots, and adding that up for each event that happens. So events often have multiple vaccines, including sometimes a flu vaccine along with some vaccine that contains aluminum. So you can get aluminum and mercury at the same time in one event. And they are synergistically toxic. So when the aluminum was present with the mercury, I multiplied the number by 1.5 to take that into account. And I gave them mercury a weight of 2 because I'm just guessing that it's probably twice as toxic as aluminum. That's the red plot here, and it goes again from 1991 to 2013. And the blue plot is the counts of all the events that mentioned either autism or anxiety disorder or pervasive developmental delay. And so it's a pretty good match. It's a particularly good match at that point where there's this huge rise from 1998 to 2002. There's this very steep rise. And that's reflected in a lot more. That's mostly aluminum there, because that's right when they took out the mercury. You know, they took out the mercury and they said, oh, yes, see, mercury doesn't cause autism because the rates are going up. But what they didn't tell you, the small print, is they put the aluminum in at the same time. So that masked, I think, the effect of the mercury. And we have a paper about that. But on the far end of the curve, when you get into 2008, 2009, the aluminum's actually going down, but the mercury is going up because all of a sudden you've got all these flu vaccines. Now they're telling everybody to get the flu vaccine. So the mercury is coming back up again, and that's what's keeping it high. So we live in an age of aluminum. This is a picture from Chris Shaw's paper. And, you know, we're very comfortable with aluminum. We have aluminum foil, aluminum cans. We use aluminum-containing antiperspirants. We use aluminum-containing sunscreen. You know, we take aluminum-containing antacids. So, you know, we're not thinking about aluminum being toxic, but it's especially toxic in the context of glyphosate. And I will get to that in a moment. But, so we need to be, and of course the aluminum in the vaccines, which I find outrageous, quite frankly. And then this is just a picture from another paper, a nice paper by Kawahari and Kato Negishi from 2011. And this paper shows all the various ways in which aluminum disrupts the brain. It just has an amazing effect. It's a very, very highly reactive, highly disruptive molecule because it's a very tiny +3 charge. +3 charge is a huge amount of positive charge that you put sort of at a point location. And so it causes things to really get messed up. It messes up the iron and makes it worse. It messes up the cytoskeleton. It causes misfolded proteins and messes up ATP energy production, abnormal gene expression, and inhibiting various enzymatic reactions. So it's really messing up calcium transport and calcium metabolism. So it's really very, very destructive. This is a paper that analyzed the amount of aluminum that was contained in different parts of the brain, the cerebellum, the cortex, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. And you can see the pineal gland is the one on the furthest left. And it has well over twice as much aluminum as any of the other parts of the brain. So the aluminum tends to bioaccumulate preferentially in the pineal gland, which is why it's going to be more affected than other parts of the brain by excess aluminum in the environment. So that's that. So it takes up more than I made that point. Okay, sunlight. Sunlight is very interesting, and actually identified sunlight deficiency early on. That was one of the first things I was concerned about with autism, because I was aware that they were encouraging everybody to please make sure you put on that sunscreen, you know, whenever your child goes outside. And I was very annoyed they were doing that with my granddaughter, who's now 13 years old, and I was aware of that back when she was a baby. I was giving her mother a hard time about not putting the sunscreen on her daughter. And her pediatrician was telling her, please, you know, make sure, get the sunscreen. Sunlight is important, and it's very protective in autism, I believe. So I have a hypothesis that I've written about in some of my papers, which is an unusual hypothesis. There's this molecule called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which is a very interesting molecule that produces nitric oxide in the artery wall and causes the artery to relax and causes the blood to flow. And there's been a lot of papers written about it. There's also been papers written about its dysfunctional behavior of this enzyme, where it produces superoxide instead of nitric oxide. And that's considered to be a defect. But I think the superoxide is actually another mode, and that this enzyme is what they call a moonlighting enzyme. It has two different roles. There's these enzymes that can do two different things, and I think this one is an example of one. And so it produces, I believe, sulfate. Instead of nitric oxide, it produces basically sulfur dioxide, which gets oxidized to sulfate in the presence of sunlight. It needs the sunlight as a catalyst to do this, and it does this when it's attached to the membrane. So it's a fascinating molecule with very interesting control on where it moves in the cell and what it does. But I think if you understand that it makes sulfate in response to sunlight, it explains a lot of things. And I have a long paper that discusses all the things that it explains that are going on in the cells that contain this enos, that otherwise it doesn't make sense why they have this molecule. So that if you are not getting enough sunlight exposure to your skin, not only do you get vitamin D deficiency, but you also get sulfate deficiency. And in fact, vitamin D is sulfated when it's shipped out. It gets sulfated in transit, and that makes it more soluble in water, so it's easier to transport it in the blood. So aluminum and retinoic acid, which are both present in sunscreens, especially the high-end sunscreens, interfere with eNOS's ability to make sulfate. So if you're using sunscreen, it's worse than not being out in the sun at all in terms of disrupting sulfate synthesis. And so the pineal gland contains both eNOS and nNOS, which is another kind of nitric oxide synthase. And so both of those also, I think, make sulfate in the pineal gland. And so that would also be disrupted if the pineal gland's not getting enough sunlight. And that will be if you're not going outside. You need the bright, bright sunlight. Don't wear the sunglasses. So if you're putting your sunglasses on your kid all the time, your child's not getting enough sun exposure to the eyes. So that's another factor. So this is a really bad idea, in my opinion. So I decided to take a look at this demographics of the 50 states. You can easily get information on the web about how many sunny days, how much rain, total annual rainfall, what is the latitude, what's the altitude, all these different measures, temperature, that are all correlated with sort of sunlight exposure. And so if you can get a measure for autism for the 50 states, then you can compare those two. So you can easily do that as well, because as you know, you can get a record of the number of kids enrolled in the school system that are on the autism disability program. And so we looked at grades 1 through 6, and we looked specifically at the year 2007 to 2008. And then we can obtain all these weather statistics as well, and then we can use a simple mathematical formula called Pearson's correlation coefficient to see if there is correlation between these various parameters that we're measuring and autism. So these are the results we got. The correlations are not huge. They're in the range of 0.16 for temperature and 0.4 for the rank on the number of clear days. But all of them go in the right direction. So the negatives are rank of the number of clear days and the temperature, both of which are correlated with more sun. And then the positives are latitude. High latitude is going to be less sun. Annual rainfall is going to be less sun. This root mean squared is just a geometric mean of those two, which shows that they are independent parameters, because you get a higher number, but it's 0.34 if you put them together. The rain and the latitude, those are kind of independent parameters. Elevation is interesting because that is beneficial for autism. High states, like Colorado, have lower autism rates. And that's because I think you have more UV when you're at higher altitude. The air is thinner, the sun gets through, the sun is stronger. And then the last one here is not related to sun. This is vaccination rate. It has a pretty strong correlation. I actually have to say that I'm surprised. You can get a number like 0.38 for the correlation between vaccines. The percentage of the kids that were fully vaccinated in the various states. It's a small range, because it's something from 70 to 88 or something percent. It's not that much difference between the worst state and the best state. If we could go down to 0, we would see a much stronger measure. We'd have a much stronger detection of, I think, of this feature. And so that's the point here, that all these measures go the right way with respect to the notion that sunlight is protective against autism. So this is really interesting, and this is also something that most people are not aware of. Vitamin D prevents the kidney from wasting sulfate. So if you, they did this study with these mice where they gave them either defective vitamin D receptors in the kidney or they had vitamin D deficiency. And they showed that they had both seriously reduced serum sulfate levels, the levels of sulfate in their serum. And they also had depleted sulfate in their skeleton. And that's going to cause disruption of skeleton, like rickets kind of behavior, So the fetus depends on sulfate for its development. And it depends on the mother to supply that sulfate to it. So if the mother's sulfate deficient, the fetus is going to be also. And sulfate is essential for transporting sterols, which are really important for the fetal development. Estrogen, DHEA, there's a whole bunch of these different sterols, the sex hormones, and cholesterol and vitamin D are all sterols. And it also is important for supplying the extracellular matrix proteins with sufficient negative charge, because I mentioned sulfate is a -2 charge. And the negative charge is really, really important to make these things healthy. It detoxifies xenobiotics like Tylenol, and it's essential for excreting toxins like aluminum and mercury. And it's severely deficient in autistic children. Papers have shown 1/3 of the normal level of free sulfate in the blood, and then that goes with excess sulfate in the urine, which is correlated with the vitamin D deficiency problem. DHEA sulfate is a sterol. It's synthesized from cholesterol, and it's the most common steroid in the bloodstream. And this is a study here from 2005, was on autistic adults, and it showed that they had significantly lower serum levels of DHEA sulfate. It stimulates dendritic growth in the neurons of mice. And so mice who are engineered to be defective in DHEA synthesis die as 8-day-old embryos. They can't make it without the DHEA. So it's a very, very important molecule for development. Alzheimer's disease is also associated with sulfate deficiency. Alzheimer's patients have been shown to have very low levels of serum sulfate, 20% of the normal value. And this is looking at the ratio of cysteine to sulfate in the blood. And so all these, not just Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's, ALS, all three of those were seen to have about 5 times as much higher ratio. So 5 times 1/5 of the level of sulfate, 20%, compared to the normal controls. Because they had about the same level of cysteine as the controls, but so what was messed up with the ratio was the sulfate. The sulfate was too low. Tylenol and autism. Some of you probably know about the Tylenol connection with autism. There have been papers written about it. It's detoxified and eliminated via sulfation. Autistic kids are very severely impaired in this process, and so this reflects their reduced supply of sulfate. And then the actual administering Tylenol is going to then further deplete sulfate if you can get rid of it using the sulfate that you have. And so it's also the same pathway that's necessary to eliminate adrenaline and dopamine from the brain, so that can build up also and cause a child to be hyperactive because of the dopamine if you can't metabolize it. And you could also end up with some neurotoxic substances with psychedelic effects. So this is a paper that was recently published in 2014, February 2014, very recent paper. And this was really interesting because it talks about how vitamin D regulates serotonin synthesis. Autism is associated with low activated vitamin D and low brain serotonin. And vitamin D activates serotonin receptors in the brain, so that works together. Glyphosate suppresses the activation of vitamin D in the liver, so that's going to mess up the availability of the vitamin D to activate the serotonin receptors. Estrogen rescues females. According to this paper, they're proposing this could explain the fact that boys have autism much more than girls, because estrogen rescues the females by boosting serotonin levels in the brain. It also acts as a stimulator. And so, boys depend upon aromatase, which is a cytochrome P450 enzyme, to produce estrogen from testosterone. And so that's going to be suppressed by glyphosate because it suppresses those type enzymes. So this article recommended supplementing in both vitamin D and tryptophan. Tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. Tryptophan is the product of the shikimate pathway that glyphosate disrupts. So there's several different ways in which you can get disruption of the serotonin and the vitamin D through these mechanisms with the aluminum and the glyphosate. So glyphosate suppresses the production of tryptophan through its effect on the shikimate pathway. Okay, so I'll just summarize that. Measures of sunlight availability based on weather information reveal correlation of less sun with higher autism rates. Sulfate is synthesized in the skin and in the pineal gland upon sunlight exposure. Sulfate is essential in the fetus and is supplied by the mother. Vitamin D prevents sulfate wasting in the kidney. Sulfate deficiency is associated with both autism and Alzheimer's disease, and vitamin D activates serotonin receptors, and impaired serotonin function in the brain is associated with autism. Okay, synergistic effects of glyphosate and aluminum. That's kind of the key topic of the paper. And when I started looking, I was quite impressed with all the ways you could see how these two would interact to cause trouble. This is a quick summary of what I've found. So we know about C. difficile, which is overproduced in the gut in response to glyphosate, leading to leaky gut syndrome. It produces P-cresol. We talked about that earlier. But it turns out precresol promotes aluminum uptake by cells. So that's going to start to allow the aluminum to get into the cells. It's also, as I said, a known marker for autism. And it's an important factor in kidney failure because it's a toxic phenol. It can cause kidney failure, and kidney failure can lead then to aluminum retention in the tissues. Kidney failure is well known to produce aluminum-based dementia for people who are on dialysis treatment if you're not really careful to keep the aluminum out. So that's because it causes the aluminum to be taken up by the tissues instead of being, expelled through the kidneys. Glyphosate cages aluminum, and that promotes its entry past the gut barrier. And of course, glyphosate also produces leaky gut, which makes it easier for it to get across. And then glyphosate promotes calcium uptake by these voltage-activated channels, and aluminum pretends to be calcium and takes a ride on those same channels. So that means that glyphosate would promote aluminum uptake through those channels as well. And then aluminum also promotes calcium loss from the bones, which is going to lead to pineal gland calcification, which is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So this is really interesting, I think, all these connections. We showed this before, and I'm not sure why I put it up here again, maybe just to remind you of all these correlations and how glyphosate working synergistically with aluminum would explain why we're getting these plots to all line up, where this yellow plot is the VARS database counts of the number of adverse reactions. And this is a paper that I was really happy to find because it explains it shows the pictures of the glyphosate cages of the aluminum, all those little silver molecules in the middle. These are just 6 different ways that glyphosate can build molecular structure build this cage around the aluminum, which completely gets rid of its +3 charge and makes it a neutral molecule, which is what makes it so much easier for it to get past the barriers. And it's well known, up in the corner here I have a picture of aluminum citrate, and there's several articles that talk about how aluminum citrate, so citrate is in orange juice, and if you're taking antacids and drinking orange juice at the same time, you're sort of doing the same thing that you're doing with the glyphosate. You're allowing the aluminum to get in past the gut barrier because the citrate cages the aluminum, and that's a well-known effect that's been written about. The idea that the glyphosate does the same thing has not been written about, but you can infer that it would because it's the same process. Okay, and that's what I wanted to show here was a picture of alumina. That little tiny word you can't read there is alumina in Gelusil, so this is like a popular antacid. You have to be very careful with aluminum-containing antacids, which are commonly taken, I think, even by pregnant women, and I find that quite worrisome as well. So I said this. All right.
So would you include like citrate-containing supplements like magnesium citrate?
I would. Yeah. I mean, the citrate is okay as long as you're not also getting aluminum at the same time. It'll help you get the aluminum past the barriers. So if you have to see, magnesium citrate's okay because it's not aluminum citrate. Sorry. It would just be if you were having magnesium citrate and then somehow else in some other way getting aluminum. Yeah. Magnesium citrate is much better than aluminum citrate.
No, I understand that. I just mean, that's a common supplement, and then
you
take a vaccine, or
you're right.
you get aluminum foil, or you drink out of Capri Sun, and
You're right. Yes. So this was a paper that I wrote some years ago, 2012, a few years back, 2 years back, not that long ago, before I knew about glyphosate. But this was a study on the VARS database, and where we showed from the data that autism symptoms and aluminum in the vaccines could be correlated in the VARS database, and also the Tylenol exposure could be related indirectly in terms of what we saw from the VARS database. So you could read this paper to get the details on that. But now that I know glyphosate enhances aluminum toxicity, it starts to make sense that I was seeing so much aluminum-based, I was seeing a lot more aluminum-based type reactions after 2000 than I was seeing before 2000. The article talks about before 2000 versus after 2000. But what I didn't realize when I wrote it was that the difference is that after 2000 you have a lot more glyphosate. And I think that's what's making it's causing it to have so many more aluminum reactions showing up in the second half of the data. And glyphosate also interferes with acetaminophen metabolism due to its disruption of the cytochrome P450 enzymes. Okay, so sunlight and melatonin synthesis. This is a very fascinating topic to me. Here's a very sketchy picture of the brain, and the pineal gland there on the right is that little tiny circle in the middle, pretty much in the middle of the brain. And this is a picture of the ventricles. The ventricles are where you have the cerebral spinal fluid, and they're also very, very interesting. And you have the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, and then you have these two lateral ventricles on the two sides. They're all basically fluid-filled chambers that are supplying nutrients to the brain, the cerebral spinal fluid. And the pineal gland, I thought I was going to put it there, but the pineal gland sits right at the base of the third ventricle, so it's very attached to these ventricles and allows it to put things into the cerebral spinal fluid, in particular melatonin sulfate. And so this is a paper, and I really just wanted to give you the title, which will give you the hints about what it's about: heparan sulfate deficiency in autistic postmortem brain tissue from the subventricle zone of the lateral ventricle. So this was specifically looking at the fluids in the ventricles in the autistic brains and showing that they were deficient in heparan sulfate. And this reminds us of the paper about the mice that were designed to be impaired in the ability to make the heparan sulfate, and showing the same features again, the correlation of autism with deficiency of heparan sulfate in the brain. So here we have the third ventricle and the pineal gland. It's always hard to know how to display brain pictures because the brain is so complex, but this has sort of a picture of that region in the middle of the brain with the corpus callosum across the top, and the black is the ventricles. And the third ventricle here is with the pineal gland sitting right at the tip of the third ventricle. That's where it's situated, which is interesting, I think. And so the heparan sulfate is depleted in those fluids that are inside the ventricles. And I think it's depleted because melatonin sulfate is not working properly and it's not getting enough sulfate delivery from the pineal gland. And so this is a paper that shows that melatonin enters the cerebrospinal fluid through the pineal recess, so it's going to come in. The pineal gland is basically going to shoot that melatonin right into the cerebral spinal fluid, and then it can distribute over the whole brain and do its thing to make you sleep. So melatonin, of course, is what controls the wake-sleep cycle, and the pineal gland produces it and distributes it during the night while you're sleeping, and that's what sort of keeps you in your sleep mode. So when you don't have enough melatonin, you're going to have a hard time sleeping. And so I've pretty much said all of this. This is just a picture of melatonin here at the bottom with the sulfate attached to it. That's the melatonin sulfate. And in the cerebrospinal fluid, it's mostly present as melatonin sulfate. Here's another picture of the pineal gland. Sunlight. Okay, this is just showing that when the sun is shining during the day, the pineal gland, which is sitting right behind the eyes, responds to the sunlight and produces sulfate. And here's a paper that shows that that's the case, which has a rather hefty title, but light-induced 3-O-sulfotransferase, that's the enzyme that's going to produce the sulfate. The expression of that enzyme modifies the pineal heparan sulfate, a surprising link to circadian rhythm. So what this is saying is that during the time when there's light, the pineal gland is building up heparan sulfate. Now, the heparan sulfate is the stuff that's deficient in autism. And it builds it up during the day in response to the light. And then at night, it takes the sulfate off the heparin and attaches it to the melatonin and ships it into the cerebral spinal fluid. So the melatonin is a delivery system for the sulfate to the brain. So I think that's probably everything. Yeah, and so melatonin is highly lipophilic. When you add sulfate to it, it makes it water-soluble, which means it can go into the cerebral spinal fluid without a problem. And then once it arrives, it drops off the sulfate. It sort of says, here's your sulfate, and by the way, I'm the one who delivered it to you. So the signal is a melatonin signal, but I think the signal is also the fact that you now have a sulfate to work with, because the sulfates are so valuable to the cells. So it's a sulfate delivery system. So I have this picture, pineal gland, seat of the soul, just to summarize. Produces sulfate by day, responding to the light, stores it as heparan sulfate, sticks it all around the cell, and then at night, it produces melatonin, and then it hooks up the sulfate to the melatonin and ships it into all the parts of the brain via the cerebral spinal fluid. So REM sleep cycle, melatonin induces REM sleep cycle. Alzheimer's is associated with reduced REM sleep and calcified pineal gland. And the amount of calcification in the pineal gland is inversely correlated with the amount of REM sleep, meaning that calcification is disrupting the REM sleep. And then DHEA sulfate, which we talked about before, but not DHEA, increases melatonin production. So I think it increases the production because it provides the sulfate. So it's another way to get the sulfate besides the heparin sulfate that you could have gotten if you had exposed the pineal gland to sunlight. So the brain really, really needs sulfate, and it has a whole bunch of different mechanisms to deliver the sulfate to the brain, one of which, a really important one of which, is melatonin. And there's a sulfate on the melatonin there. Okay, recapitulation. Autism is associated with a severe deficiency in sulfate supplies to the brain, and the pineal gland can synthesize sulfate stimulated by sunlight and deliver it via melatonin sulfate to the brain. Aluminum, mercury, and glyphosate all work synergistically to derail this process. Impaired sleep due to melatonin deficiency characterizes many neurological diseases, and sunlight deficiency contributes to this pathology. Okay, digestive system disorders. So I heard Dr. Roy Dittman speak here last year, and he said these quotes when he spoke, and I wrote them down. I like both of these. If the microbial world is the substrate for life, why are we waging war on it? And then the same chemicals we use to sterilize our environment sterilize us. So, sobering thoughts. Gut microbes, does that come out? Oh yeah, that's good. You all know gut microbes outnumber our own cells 10 to 1, so we are basically a colony of microbes, and 200 to 300 different species, 100 to 1 on the genomic code, and they have 100 times as much genomic material as we do. And glyphosate causes the beneficial ones to die and the pathogens to overgrow, and the pathogens release things like precresol, we've heard all of this, which can lead to inflammatory bowel disease. But an interesting thing is that this experiment in this paper took gut microbes from an obese person, put them into a mouse, and made that mouse obese by doing that. So I think that the particular distribution of gut microbes that you have could be playing a really important role in obesity. This is a really complicated slide that I'm not going to go over in detail. I'm just going to sort of highlight some pieces of it that connect up with my theories. We have here repeated antibiotic treatment here on the left-hand corner. Glyphosate is basically an antibiotic, so you're starting with, they're saying in this paper, they're arguing if you get too much antibiotic in your gut, you disrupt your gut. Glyphosate can certainly do that. And then we have the next one here is this LPS, lipopolysaccharide, various kinds of endotoxins released by these bacteria are going to cause an inflammatory response, and that's this overgrowth of pathogens that happens with the glyphosate. And then up here we have sulfate reduction up here on this pink I'm pointing on the screen as if you can see it, but the sulfate reduction on the upper right-hand corner, sulfate reduction going up means that you're losing sulfate, reduced sulfate. These bacteria are reducing sulfate. That's like the sulfovibria that I talked about before. And so you're going to lose sulfate, you're going to get the leaky gut, which is this reduced gut lining integrity, leaky gut. And then I guess that's it. So basically you can sort of see that pattern overlaid on this graph from that paper showing what's going on with the glyphosate. This is a plot that was arguing that this paper was arguing that sugar could be responsible for obesity, the obesity epidemic in the U.S. I think they're wrong. I think sugar is contributing. The upper plot is the sort of use of sugar over time. They went all the way back to 1700 with that one. Looking at obesity, they start at 1900 with the plot. And you can see that there's a slowly rising obesity problem from 1900 to 1975. Glyphosate was introduced into the food chain in 1975, and that's when you have a corner. And all of a sudden the obesity is going up like this. So I think it's possible that the reason why we have the corner is because of the glyphosate. And as we get more and more glyphosate, we get fatter and fatter. Now I want to talk about inflammation. There's been some interesting studies recently on animals that are getting fed GMO Roundup Ready feed. And they are really getting sick. And this was a study that was done inspired by the fact that they were noticing that the pigs in the farm that were being fed the GMO feed were getting sick. They were getting a lot of stomach problems, and with ulcers and thinning of the intestinal walls, hemorrhagic bowel disease. So they decided to do a formal experiment. With 168 just weaned pigs, they fed them a typical diet of GMOs, corn and soy, or organic corn and soy. That was the control group. And then they looked at, they analyzed after they slaughtered them, they took a look at their stomachs. And does this come out on the picture? Yes, you can see the bottom one is much redder, and that's the one for the GMO feed. The stomach was really highly inflamed. And also the female pigs had enlarged uterus. So some indication of a problem with the reproductive system. And the males were much more susceptible to the gut problem than the females were, possibly because the uterus was sort of deflecting the load or something. But this is another set of pigs that are being studied in Europe. This is a huge farm by this guy, Ib Peterson, 13,000 pigs a year. It's Europe's largest pork supply company. And this is just a quote from him. And he saw all these symptoms using the GMO feed, including pigs born with deformities, like the picture on the right. And then when he would switch to organic, these problems would sometimes go away very, very quickly. So that's really encouraging that you might be able to just switch to organic and get a lot of progress. This is a book that I read, which is quite fun. It's written by Leah Dunham. She's the daughter of a veterinarian who takes care of pigs in Iowa on all these farms. And he has seen the erosion of their health over time. And so she shows in the book all the different problems that he's encountered and how he's fixed them by putting these pigs on an organic diet. They're getting to the point where like 20% of the piglets, once they're weaned, they simply refuse to eat. And they would rather die. And so the piglets are dying because of malnutrition, because they won't eat. They won't eat the GMO feed. So there's a lot of different problems with human digestive system disorders these days. Alarming increase in many diseases related to the gut. Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, colitis, acid reflux, gluten, casein intolerance. You guys all know about the celiac disease, leaky gut. Obviously also correlated with autism. And so the gut-brain axis is linking these neurological disorders with the gut disorders. And I believe glyphosate is a major cause of this problem. So you all know that there's now the new gluten-free section of all the different grocery stores all across the country. This is really a very recent phenomenon. I don't even remember hearing about gluten-free even maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Here's a book about a hidden epidemic of celiac disease. The rate's quadrupled in the last 50 years. So what's going on here? Well, here's a plot of celiac disease. This is hospital discharge diagnosis for celiac disease. This is U.S. government data available on the web. That's the yellow boxes. And the green line is glyphosate usage on wheat. So not corn and soy, wheat. And you can see there's a pretty good correspondence, not quite as spectacular as the correspondence with autism and Alzheimer's. But why is glyphosate usage on wheat going up? I bet nobody in this audience knows. Does anybody know? So there's this new practice that's becoming more and more popular, which is wheat is not Roundup ready. And luckily we've kept that out. They've tried to get Monsanto has tried to get the farmers to embrace Roundup ready wheat, and they've refused. So it's not Roundup ready. But what they've learned to do is to spray the wheat with Roundup 3 days before the harvest with the intent of killing it. So they want to just kill the crop, grab the seed, and then let it die quickly so they'll have less debris to clean up. And so that's going to make the Roundup get into the seed, get into the bread, and cause celiac disease. So, yes, I guess I answered the question. I was going to put that. What's happening is they're getting this ryegrass growing up in the wheat that's resistant to the glyphosate. And so they're having trouble dealing with it. So what they're learning to do is spray the wheat. So they spray the wheat with a Roundup and also kill the ryegrass. And that's going to help get ready for next year's crop. You can kill the ryegrass for next year's crop at the same time as you kill the wheat that you're harvesting to put into the food. So they say we may be able to knock down out 80 to 90% of the resistant ryegrass with glyphosate. And so this is really, people are being encouraged to do this. They see their neighbor did it. It worked well for them. Why don't I do that too? No one's thinking about maybe this stuff is toxic. And I do believe that's why we have a epidemic in celiac disease today. So it's not just wheat that they're doing this to. They're also doing it to sugarcane. So this means basically you almost can't eat any sugar unless it's organic, because you can have high fructose corn syrup, which comes from GMO Roundup Ready corn, or you can have beet sugar, which comes from GMO Roundup Ready beets, or you can have sugarcane, which comes from sugarcane that's been sprayed with Roundup right before the harvest. Or you can eat honey, but the bees are dying, I think, because of Roundup exposure. So the honey's going to have Roundup in it as well. So pretty much you can't eat sugar unless it's organic. So these are the various advantages I've already mentioned here about reducing the amount of strain on the compound as you have to clear the crop and killing next year's weeds and hastening maturity. You get a sharper harvest. I think you can increase the yield a little bit. Although I've seen that the yield is going down. I just saw a report that was put out this year that was showing a decrease in the yield on wheat in U.S. farms, and I'm having a suspicion that that may be because of this continued year-by-year exposure to Roundup that's actually messing up the quality of the wheat in the soil, I mean the Roundup residual in the soil and things like that. So, so you get the contamination in the products. And so the crops include, and I'm really surprised by this, wheat, barley. I mean, basically barley's going to go into beer, so you have to eat organic beer, drink organic beer. Legumes, corn, sunflower, kiwi, grapes, which is wine, raspberries, apples, soybeans, alfalfa, and sugarcane. So that's quite a big list of crops that are being sprayed with Roundup right before the harvest. Okay, a human dietary experiment on wheat and inflammatory bowel syndrome. This came out very recently, 2014. Was great because they showed that when they switched these people who had inflammatory bowel syndrome to an organic heirloom version of wheat, their symptoms went way down. These are highly significant results on abdominal pain, bloating, stool consistency, tiredness, P0.0001. Very, very significant results of improvement in their gut problems from eating this organic wheat. It's a different strain, and in fact, in the paper, they kind of acted like they thought the main reason was that it was a different strain. And people are thinking about, because the wheat has been evolving. It's not so much GMO, but they do use all this genetic, other kinds of genetic manipulations. So the wheat that we have today is not the same as the heirloom wheat. But the fact that they made it organic, to me, is the key fact that made it healthy. And they need to do the experiment again, where they, do an organic non-heirloom wheat and see if they get a similar result. So we don't know whether it's the change in the quality of the wheat itself, the proteins in the plant, or the removal of the poison on the wheat. And so it reduced all these inflammatory cytokines, which was a specific technical indicator that it was doing something good. Okay, so Anthony Sampson and I wrote that first paper on glyphosate where we explained all these different features that would relate it to all these modern diseases. And we followed it about 9 months later with a second paper where we looked into celiac disease, glyphosate pathways to modern diseases 2, celiac, sprue, and gluten intolerance. And it was amazing. We looked at all the different features. Celiac disease, like autism, has a lot of complicated comorbidities. And we went through every one of them, and we could explain each one of them from things we knew about glyphosate to say that if glyphosate does this, then it would be expected that it would cause this problem. So it was a very, very strong, we felt it was a very strong argument. It's all innuendo because people haven't done the actual experiments, such as what I just mentioned. This experiment that was just done is flawed because it's a different kind of wheat. But if you did it with the same wheat, with and without the glyphosate, you could answer that question as to whether it's causing a gut disruption explicitly rather than just inferring it from the evidence, epidemiological evidence and things like that. So this is out of our paper. We had a lot of different things, but these are just some highlights. Bifidobacteria are a beneficial bacteria that are depleted in association with celiac disease. And they convert gluten to a less toxic form, so it's very important for them not to be depleted. And it's one of the bacteria that glyphosate preferentially kills, according to an article that was done on chickens. Celiac disease is associated with increased risk to cancer, and in fact, that's what causes celiac patients on average to die 4 years too early. And in particular, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is one of the most common cancers that they get. And glyphosate has been also linked directly to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In a separate paper. So these are just how you can connect the dots between these things. Pseudomonas is another interesting bacterium which has become a huge pest in hospitals along with C. difficile. You've probably been hearing about the troubles that hospitals are having with runaway infections that they can't fix in these very immune-impaired people that come in. They throw the kitchen sink of all these different antibiotics at them and the bug doesn't die. Pseudomonas is one of those bugs. It's a gram-negative bacterium, and it's one of only 3 known species of bacteria that can break down glyphosate. And so I suspect that's what gives it an edge over other species, because it can actually use glyphosate as fuel, whereas the other species are going to react to its toxicity. In breaking down glyphosate, it produces formaldehyde, and formaldehyde is a well-established neurotoxin, so the formaldehyde can make its way to the brain and cause trouble. So that's just another example of a way in which glyphosate might be causing brain damage. And so this is a paper about celiac children with inflammatory bowel disease, and what they're seeing, of course, is that children are getting inflammatory bowel disease much more often in recent times. So the patients were all less than 20 years old, and they saw a 49% increase in Crohn's disease and a 71% increase in ulcerative colitis among these children. These are Crohn's disease is not something a child should be getting. It's just ridiculous that children are getting these diseases. So here's another one of these plots of glyphosate applied to corn and soy, which is the red, or purple, I guess. And then the other one is the death rate. The yellow boxes is the death rate due to intestinal infection. So extremely good match here with intestinal infection. Kidney failure. So it turns out agricultural workers in Central America and also in India are suffering in record numbers from kidney failure. These are young men that are dying of kidney failure early in life, particularly in the sugarcane fields in Central America, and also the rice paddies in Sri Lanka. And so people are studying it, and they were trying to figure out maybe it's the arsenic, because some of these soils have high arsenic. So they're thinking maybe the arsenic is killing the kidney. And they're thinking, maybe they've got a lot of aches and pains, and they're taking too much Tylenol, and that's messing up the kidney. So they have these hypotheses. I mean, the Tylenol could be a factor because glyphosate makes Tylenol much more toxic than it would otherwise be. We know the sugarcane is being sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest, so they're getting exposed to it right before they do the harvest. And if you look at, again, plots of glyphosate usage in corn and soy compared to, this is acute kidney failure death rates in the U.S. This is in the U.S. And the other blue line is percent of the corn and soy that's GE, Roundup Ready. And the red line is the amount of glyphosate applied. And so those two lines basically wrap around the kidney failure curve. Very, very strong correlation here with kidney failure. And so this was a paper that came out of Sri Lanka. These people took a hard look at these kidney failure agricultural workers trying to figure out what was causing it. And they came away with the decision that it was being caused by glyphosate. Glyphosate working in conjunction with what they call nephrotoxic metals that are toxic to the kidney. And in particular, what they were talking about here was arsenic. So they looked at different regions of Sri Lanka. Where were they dying of kidney failure? Where were they not? And they found that they weren't dying if there wasn't glyphosate. So it was very clear that glyphosate was somehow related. And then if you also had high arsenic in the soil, which you often did because arsenic had been used as an herbicide prior to glyphosate. So they already had the arsenic from before, and now they have the glyphosate. And so this is a synergistic combination of two different ways to kill weeds that's causing the kidney to fail in these humans. And so because of this paper, Sri Lanka actually banned, the government immediately just said, okay, we're banning glyphosate from the farms. They cannot use the glyphosate on these farms. I was really impressed that the government was so proactive in responding to this paper. The U.S. government would not be the same. They're basically turning a blind ear to what we're saying about the dangers of glyphosate. And so this is also similar to what I'm saying with respect to glyphosate chelating aluminum. This is an example where it chelates the arsenic, and they particularly talked about that the glyphosate cages the arsenic, carries it past the gut barrier, carries it even past the liver. and takes it to the kidney, and then in the acidic environment of the terminal watershed of the kidney, it drops it off. So it's like it's bringing in a stealth bomb and delivering it to the kidney. And I think it's doing the same thing with the aluminum, except it's delivering it to the brain. And so El Salvador has a similar problem. That's in Central America. They're doing the sugarcane fields, and they also responded by banning glyphosate usage on the crops. So I'm hoping with this, this beginnings of government action against this product, I'm hoping there will be a sort of tidal wave that might come as more and more people realize how dangerous this product is. So to summarize, we depend on our gut bacteria in many ways. An obese person's gut bacteria can induce obesity in a mouse. Glyphosate is an antibiotic that preferentially kills the good bacteria. The pigs, if they're fed GMO corn and soy, they get sick. They get inflammatory gut. Humans are experiencing an epidemic in various gut disorders, and that's likely due to their exposure to glyphosate. Due to herbicide-resistant ryegrass, farmers are using glyphosate as a desiccant at harvest time, and kidney failure among the agricultural workers can be explained by glyphosate. Okay, infertility and birth defects. So, fertility rates are dropping worldwide. Europe is getting quite worried. They've been doing a lot of studies and finding bad news. Many countries are now not reproducing themselves. They've got the fertility rate down below 2.0. If you do the math, it doesn't take that long to disappear the society if you keep it down below 2.0. Certainly cultural changes are playing a role. And of course, this is just like they say, there's more reporting. They can say, people are just choosing to have fewer kids. And you're not sure what is the real answer there. But certainly in some countries, in Brazil, the birth rate has precipitously dropped from something like 6 children per mother down to like less than 2 in the last maybe 10 years or so. So I think glyphosate could be playing a role in this infertility problem. And so I'm aware that sperm depend upon cholesterol sulfate for decapitation and for fertilization. And cholesterol sulfate synthesis in the skin depends upon cytochrome P450 enzymes. So there's a connection where you might imagine that cholesterol sulfate deficiency is causing disrupted sperm fertilization. And so here's a study from Europe, and they looked at 26,000 men in France, and they found that the sperm concentration had decreased by 32% since the 1990s. The numbers steadily dropped by 2% per year from 1989 to 2005. And also the proportion of normally formed sperm was also dropped by 1/3. And then this paper, is it the same paper? Different paper. This defect likely also transfers to subsequent generations. So it's not just the sperm this generation, but the following generation continues to have a defect through epigenetic effects. And this was a study that used designer mice who were obese, and they gave them a fast food diet, and it reduced their fertility, both the male and female offspring, and that reduced fertility continued over the next generation, even though the next generation was not given that diet. So this is an epigenetic effect, which can program you towards a subfertility goal of reducing your chances of producing offspring. So here's a paper by Michael Antoniou from 2011, and a quote from that paper. The title is "Roundup and Birth Defects, Is the Public Being Kept in the Dark?" Our examination of the evidence leads us to conclude that the current approval of glyphosate and Roundup is deeply flawed and unreliable. We show that industry and regulators knew as long ago as the 1980s and 1990s that glyphosate causes malformation, but that this information was not made public. So another indictment of the regulatory process. This is a remarkable story, in my opinion, about a really rare birth defect that's showing up in abnormal numbers in Tacoma County in Washington State, the eastern part of Washington State. They have an unusual high number of this pregnancies showing up with this very, very rare disorder. So they took a look at 75 different pesticides that they thought might be involved to try to figure out which one might be responsible. And they detected 63% of these different pesticides were detected. Glyphosate was used in large amounts heavily around the irrigation ditches to control the weeds. And it was the main herbicide that was recommended because of its quote-unquote low toxicity. But they didn't bother to even investigate glyphosate because they knew that it was harmless to humans. This is what's happening, is because people believe that this thing is not harmful. They're not paying attention to what's happening with it. It turns out it's been linked directly to anencephaly in papers that have been written on frogs. And they even know why. It's due to its effect on retinoic acid. So this is a paper, for example, from Carrasco. He sadly just died, and he did some really good research on the effect of glyphosate on frogs, on amphibians. And this is a picture from his paper where he shows that glyphosate causes retinoic acid to go up, which inhibits the expression of these various proteins that are involved in development of the brain, and causes all these different malformations in the head, one of which is microcephaly, which is small brain, so it's very close to anencephaly. Same thing happening in the frogs as is happening in the humans. This is a new article on GMO soy imports in China. I'm watching China very carefully right now. You know maybe that Russia, Putin has taken a very strong stand against GMOs, and he's sort of saying, you guys in the West, you can go ahead and eat your GMO food, I don't care, but we're not going to allow any of it in Russia. And in fact, people will be prosecuted if they bring GMO foods into Russia. He's being very strict. And so in China, they're starting to really wake up to realize that something fishy is going on, because they have switched over from growing their own soy to importing it from the West, because we produce such cheap soy, because we have this very efficient method of killing the weeds. So both South America and North America now provide China with a huge amount of their soy, and at the same time, people are getting sick. So they're seeing now, all of a sudden, a 100-fold increase in autism. Infertility rates are going up. So it was only 3% in 1972, and now it's 15% in 2012. Parkinson's disease has skyrocketed 20-fold over the last 20 years. So they are becoming aware that something's wrong with our food, and they are going to, I think, China hopefully will actually do something about it, because they don't have all the vested interest in Monsanto that we do here. Monsanto is an American company, headquarters in St. Louis, Missouri. So we are very prone to look the other way. America is. Whereas other countries, I think, will be more proactive. So that's my hope, that China will actually do something about this. So now manganese. Manganese is a topic I'm very fond of lately. I didn't really think of manganese until relatively recently. I had sort of seen it out of the corner of my eye. I keep seeing manganese, and I think, well, manganese, yeah, plants, okay, manganese. I sort of didn't think, you don't hear about manganese deficiency in humans. You just don't hear about it. So I figured it probably wasn't a problem. Just like sulfur, by the way. Sulfur doesn't have a minimum daily requirement. And I think we're all sulfur deficient in the modern world, because the sulfur is depleted in the soil. Glyphosate wrecks the sulfur system. You see the autistic kids have all these problems with sulfur. And, people are talking about garlic and broccoli as being really healthy food choices. They're very loaded. They have a really good supply of sulfur. So I think the foods that are good for you contain sulfur. And also the seafood. Seafood is a really good food for sulfur. But manganese, I didn't even know what foods contained manganese. And I didn't know what manganese did in the body. And I thought, well, I'll tell you why. I'll show you in a moment why I got interested. But you start with this, which is the mechanism by which glyphosate actually messes up the enzyme, which produces the problem with the shikimate pathway. The mechanism is actually a manganese-based mechanism. It chelates the manganese that's the cofactor. Just like mercury messes up the cofactor for the molybdenum that allows sulfide oxidase to work, glyphosate messes up this enzyme because of chelating the manganese. So it says it steals the ignition key of the enzyme, which is the reactive. Manganese makes it do its thing, right? And then here's another one that talks about manganese. Fundamentally, the herbicidal effect of glyphosate is ultimately due to soil pathogens gaining access to the weed thanks to glyphosate's weakening of the plant and killing of the beneficial microbes by the chelation of manganese. So that's an important sentence, killing the beneficial microbes by the chelation of manganese. In other words, it's the manganese deprivation that's causing those beneficial bacteria to die in the soil. So we can guess that maybe that's what's happening in the gut as well, that the beneficial bacteria depend upon the manganese in order to grow. So here is a picture of plants. So if you think about it, if glyphosate is going to mess up the manganese in the plants that you're eating, then you're not going to get enough manganese in your diet. And certainly dramatically, this is iron, manganese, and zinc, all of which are very, very important to your health, and all of which are severely depleted by glyphosate in terms of the root uptake, but also in terms of the translocation to the shoot. So when you're eating plants that have been exposed to glyphosate, they're going to be depleted in these critical nutrients. And manganese in particular is the most dramatic. So already drastically reduced in the root. So this is the paper that made me start looking at manganese. This is cows. Cows are animals. And these are farms. Each of these boxes, so if you have these two plots here, cobalt on the top and manganese on the bottom. And you have 8 data points, which are 8 different farms. And these are in Denmark. And every farm had a bunch of cows. So in every cow, in every farm, they found severe deficiency in cobalt and manganese. And those were the 2 micronutrients that were obviously severely impaired. The other ones, they were sort of okay. So these are the 2 you should worry about, I would think, in humans, if you're seeing that in cows. The 2 boxes on the right are the reference, the min and max of the reference values that you would expect to see. So you can see that they're way below, all the farms, way below the minimum value in the estimate of where it should be in the blood. So huge hint, manganese. That was when I said, oh my God, I got to go look at manganese. And I was so cobalt is going to be cobalamin deficiency. I mean, we get cobalamin from animal products, but if they're not getting it, we're not going to get it either, you know. So I think that could go a long ways towards explaining cobalamin deficiency, B12, which is certainly something we're having a lot of problems with in the autistic kids and also causing dementia. But manganese, you know, big question. I was like, well, what does manganese do? I don't know. So several things. We're going to start with lactobacillus. You see it said the manganese disrupted the beneficial bacteria. Lactobacillus is definitely a beneficial bacterium, and it definitely needs manganese. And so this was a paper that looked at glyphosate on 3 food the effect of glyphosate and Roundup on 3 food microorganisms that are widely used as starters in dairy technology. So that's going to be like making yogurt and things like that, the fermented dairy. And they saw that both Roundup and glyphosate were toxic. And Roundup was toxic from levels 10 to 100 times below the lowest agricultural uses. So very small amounts of Roundup caused toxicity in these lactobacillus. And so they say that then you have to worry about the unpredictable consequences of Roundup on the soil microorganisms. They didn't say the gut microorganisms, but they should have. Soil and gut, they're kind of the same thing. I was really delighted to see this paper, which actually specifically said that lactobacillus are critically dependent on high levels of manganese for their health. They actually use manganese as an antioxidant. I guess I messed up this slide a bit, didn't I? Manganese deprivation suppresses growth. Sorry about that. I've got that a little bit messed up with the picture hiding it. But manganese is a scavenger of toxic oxygen species in lactobacillus. They're unusual that way. They have an unusual feature that they really like to use lots of manganese for their antioxidant effects. So that's going to cause them, or suppresses their growth. Manganese deprivation suppresses the growth of these bacteria, which is what you're seeing with the glyphosate. And so they're low also in the gut in association with autism. That's been shown. Now, the other really interesting thing is that lactobacillus is connected to anxiety. So low lactobacillus causes anxiety in the brain. This is through the gut-brain axis. And this was a study that was done on patients who suffer from chronic fatigue syndrome, which has a lot of things in common with autism. And these people also had anxiety associated with their disease. And they were treated with a probiotic strain of lactobacillus compared to a placebo group. And they saw a nice benefit, not only for the lactobacillus, but also for the bifidobacteria, which are also really important. Both of them got better in the gut because of the lactobacillus supplement. And this significantly decreased their anxiety symptoms, P equals 0.01. So that's a significant result, which of course supports the concept of a gut-brain axis. So by having the unhealthy gut lactobacillus communicates to the brain that it's unhealthy, and that causes the brain to get anxious. So, and of course, increased anxiety is a comorbidity of autism, and this is a paper that shows that with children with autism suffering from many forms of anxiety, in higher numbers in the general population, and this is various things: specific phobia, obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, separation anxiety, panic disorder. All these different things in varying degrees are showing up in the autistic kids. So here's another plot, and again, all this data, by the way, is available on the web and is maintained by the U.S. government. So you could also build these plots yourselves. This is an example of glyphosate usage on corn and soy compared to anxiety, panic disorder, and phobias in the U.S. over time, 1990 to 2009. And you can see a pretty good correspondence here between these two. The blue is the glyphosate, and the other color is the anxiety. These are a couple pretty pictures of molecules, these things that, there's these fancy molecules that hide these cobalt and iron inside a cage. And these are healthy mechanisms that the biology uses to transport these molecules. These are really important molecules that are needed for all these different enzyme reactions that they're used for. And the bacteria can produce these cages around them and deliver them to you in that form, which is a healthy way of getting those molecules into your body. So when the glyphosate chelates cobalt and iron prevents these bacteria from producing these important molecules. So that's going to disrupt the bacteria from producing these cages. But glyphosate will produce its own cage, but it's not a natural molecule that you're expecting. Heme iron is much more easily imported past the gut than free iron. And it's much safer because it's hiding inside the cage. It protects you from the iron, from the dangers of the iron in the wrong place. So glyphosate's going to mess that up. Okay, so manganese deficiency, moving forward with manganese, glutamate, and pneumonia. And this was something that really shocked me because I was well aware. I had written a paper about excess glutamate and excess ammonia in the brain causing a sort of low-grade encephalitis in association with autism. I had written that paper. And I had some explanation for what was causing these things, but there's a much more straightforward explanation, which is simply that manganese interferes with glutamine synthase. So glyphosate and glutamate, this was a study actually showing that glyphosate has a direct effect on the NMDA receptors in the brain, causing, this exposure was a acute exposure to these, I think it was mice, or now I'm forgetting the details of this, but they did have I think there was an exposure to the mother while they were in the womb. The chronic was that they were exposed while they were, during gestation, and then they were not exposed after they were born. And the acute exposure was that they were given an acute exposure to glyphosate over a short time period after they were born. And both of them showed various kinds of problems to these neurons in response to the glyphosate, including oxidative stress, neural cell death, and increased glutamate release into the synaptic cleft, which caused excessive extracellular glutamate levels, and that's what we're seeing in autism. Decreased glutathione content, and glutathione reduction is also a feature of autism. And then increased peroxidation of fats, which means it's destroying the membranes of the cells due to oxidation damage. And then the chronic exposure had fewer things, but a similar situation of decreased glutamate uptake, and calcium uptake was increased, and oxidative stress was increased. So here's the trick. Glutamine synthase depends on manganese. It's there's a small set of enzymes that depend on manganese to work, and glutamine synthase is one of them, synthetase. And so here's these equations across the page. You've got glutamate on the left. You lose an HEP molecule to produce this intermediate molecule, and then you add ammonia on the right to produce the glutamine, and that's where you need the manganese to make that reaction work. So if you don't have enough manganese, you're going to pile up the glutamate because you can't do this reaction. And this actually goes on in the astrocytes. The astrocytes actually pull the glutamate out of the synapse and turn it into glutamine, and then they ship it back out as glutamine, which your neuron takes up, and that prevents you from having glutamate hanging out in the extracellular spaces where it shouldn't be. So that's really important, this role that the astrocytes play. But they can't do it if something's disrupting their ability to convert it to glutamine. So this is a paper that you can't read all these numbers, but all these words on this graph are various proteins, amino acids. These people looked at all these different amino acids and looked at their levels in the blood to see if any were abnormal. And they identified only 2. You can see these 2 right here, which were out of whack. All the other ones were pretty much the same in the controls and the autistic kids. And these 2 have a p-value of 0.002 on the glutamate being too much in the autistic case, and the glutamine 0.0004, a p-value for being too little. So those are exactly the ones that are corresponding to the manganese deficiency, not allowing you to turn the glutamate into glutamine. So those are the only 2 that were abnormal. So this is I really love it when I find these blogs by mothers of autistic kids. Those have been so useful to me to help me figure out my story. Some of them are so thoughtful and so technically astute, and they're figuring out all these connections and making inferences and really making progress. This particular mother had come up with all these different steps that she tried to improve her daughter's autism. Starting with kale, cucumber, cilantro, nuts, seeds, and fruits, that's actually a really good source of manganese in a lot of those foods. And then she's doing the B complex, which is disrupted by glyphosate, vitamin D, which is disrupted. Omega-3 fats are really essential for the brain, so she was picking, magnesium is also an issue which I haven't talked about. The third one is probiotics, which we know that's needed to replenish the gut. And then, of course, gluten-free and casein-free is going to get rid of the glyphosate in the wheat and the milk. And so her child made a lot of improvements, but she still wasn't there. And then in the second round, she figured out eliminate free glutamate. So that's like MSG. And she said that was really hard to do because it's everywhere in our food. It's often hidden. They don't really necessarily call it glutamate. You have to really watch out for the different ingredients to make sure you don't expose your child to that. And once she succeeded in getting rid of the glutamate, her child lost the autism label. She said that was the critical thing that made the difference. And so it's great that she did this and that she was able to restore her child to health. And it points out the dangers of glutamate, which, of course, MSG is everywhere in our food, to a child who can't turn it into glutamine. Free glutamate becomes very toxic, just like sulfite becomes toxic to a child who can't turn it into sulfate. So if you're eating these sulfite preserved raisins or something, you're going to have problems if you can't turn it into sulfate. So, mitochondria, so manganese again. I mean, I was just so astonished when I went through the manganese because I knew each one of these things I'm finding, I already knew that those were a feature of autism, but I didn't have any idea that manganese could be a reason for it. Mitochondrial disorder, you've heard a lot about mitochondrial disorder. I've heard talks about it here. Well established that it's a feature of autism. Here's just one example of a study where half the patients studied were classified with a definite mitochondrial respiratory chain disorder. And they were saying this might be one of the most common features of autism. So manganese superoxide dismutase is the second enzyme that I found that plays a critical role in protecting the mitochondria from oxidative damage. So if that's not working, you're going to have oxidative damage, you're going to damage the mitochondria, and you're going to see this feature of autism. Of course, it's also a feature of many other diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is a graph of the various ways that superoxide on the left, that's the dangerous molecule that causes all the oxidative damage that you've been hearing about. Manganese superoxide dismutase is the enzyme that turns that into hydrogen peroxide. That's the H2O2 in the middle. And then you have these other pathways, which one of them involves glutathione, which is depleted by glyphosate, and the other one involves catalase, which depends on iron. And so these are the selenium over here, which is caged by glyphosate, and iron, which is caged by glyphosate. So basically all of these enzymes that are just detoxifying the superoxide could be impaired by glyphosate. And that could explain why you have the mitochondrial dysfunction. So this is a picture of the citric acid cycle, very famous cycle. It's one of the first things you learn in the biology class. This is what produces ATP. So it breaks down sugar and turns it into energy. And this part on the right-hand corner of this graph, the citrate, going to isocitrate, that is the first step of the cycle. So if that's ruined, you're going to be in trouble producing ATP. And aconitase is the enzyme that makes that happen. And aconitase turns out to be extremely sensitive to oxidation by superoxide, which will cause it to become inactive. So that means that this cycle won't work and the mitochondria won't be able to produce ATP, and once your cell can't make energy, it's going to be in trouble and it's going to have to fold shop and die. So aconitase dysfunction turns out to be a feature of autism. And so this was an example that looked at post-mortem brain samples, tissues, from the cerebellum and the temporal cortex of autistic patients compared to controls. Aconitase activity was significantly reduced in the cerebellum, and it was correlated also with low glutathione levels. And of course, glutathione is depleted by glyphosate. And so also biomarkers of inflammation were increased, which is an indication of superoxide that isn't being detoxified. And so this is a plot from this paper, and the open circles are the autistic kids, and the closed circles are the normals, the controls. Pretty good separation here, where the autistic kids have both low aconitase and low ratio. This is the ratio of reduced to oxidized glutathione, which is something that people here have talked about a lot. Too little of the reduced form of glutathione is a feature of autism. Okay, and now there's another one, impaired bone development, also connected to the manganese deficiency. Again, Roundup. And so this is at first an experiment of glyphosate, and what does it do to bone development? And so these dams were treated with glyphosate from day 6 to day 15 of their pregnancy. And it had a lot of effects on the development of the pup's bones. Their ossification centers didn't develop properly in their basically fingers and toes, and their soft spot on their brain was incomplete development of the skull bones. And then they had an absence of important bones or parts of bones in various shortenings and bendings and asymmetry and fusions and things like cleft palate due to the exposure to the glyphosate. And this surfactant, which is the polyoxyethylene amine, is the additional adjuvant that's added to the Roundup to make glyphosate more toxic, and that did in fact increase the toxicity of glyphosate in this experiment. This is a quote, I guess, from this paper on manganese in bones. The multiple cellular effects of manganese deficiency include decreased bone resorption, production of labile bone, decreased synthesis of organic matrix. The organic matrix is this extracellular, the glycoproteins, the thing that the heparin sulfate proteoglycans that I talked about before. That is the extracellular matrix. And there's actually chondroitin sulfate, which is in the case of bones, it's called chondroitin sulfate, but it's very, very similar to heparin sulfate. And that becomes, the synthesis of that becomes impaired when manganese is deficient. And so this was a study on postmenopausal women who had osteoporosis, and it showed that they had a significantly lower level of manganese in their blood compared to the age-matched controls. So I think this manganese deficiency is what's causing our current epidemic in osteoporosis. We have a lot of issues with broken bones among the elderly. People break their hip and they end up going downhill after that happens. And that's probably due to the manganese deficiency that's being caused by the glyphosate. So this is just another paper that talks about osteoblasts, which are the cells that build up the bone. And this ground substance is the thing that's made of chondroitin sulfate and collagen. And so poor mineralization results from impaired chondroitin sulfate synthesis. So the bone is not healthy if you can't make the chondroitin sulfate. And so childhood osteoarthritis and osteomalacia, which is basically rickets, it's soft bones, those are epidemic in the U.S. today, and one can guess that this manganese deficiency may be a very strong contributing factor. Chondroitin sulfate synthesis in the cartilage depends on manganese. So there's these two enzymes. One forms a sugar chain. The other one links the sugar chain to the protein that's associated with it. If you can't do this, you're not going to be able to produce this chondroitin sulfate. You're not going to have healthy bones. So perineuronal nets is another thing that depends upon chondroitin sulfate. They're really fascinating, and I think they're very poorly understood. I certainly don't understand them well enough. I'd like to learn more. And so they modulate GABA inhibitory signals. So when you don't have enough inhibitory signals, you have an excitatory situation in the brain, and that's certainly a feature of autism. And so this experiment showed that if you remove these perineuronal nets, you increase the excitability of the interneurons as you would expect. in cultures, in vitro cultures. So they provide an environment that's rich in this negative charge that's essential to keep the cells healthy because of the sulfate. So I'm thinking that the manganese deficiency leads to impaired synthesis of these perineuronal nets, and that's what's causing the increased excitability in the brain that's then leading to cell death and neuronal loss. Okay, and now we're almost done, and we'll have some time for questions. I think the coral die-off that we're seeing could very well be connected to this impaired chondroitin sulfate synthesis, because the coral really depend on, they're sort of like bones, and they depend on the chondroitin sulfate to be healthy. And so this article talked about how the sulfate groups are so important to the absorption process, and that they will absorb chondroitin sulfate. And it's a direct function of the amount of negative charge. So they need the negative charge to be healthy. That's provided by the sulfates. And then the starfish are very similar to the coral. So I've been well aware for some time now of the problem they're having off the west coast of this country with a very strange disease among the starfish that they're basically just dissolving. Their skeleton is just disappearing and turning into like a goo, blobs of goo. So it sounds really scary. And it turns out glyphosate is used to kill the seagrass in the oyster beds. And these starfish eat oysters. And so I think glyphosate and diuron is another one that are being frequently detected in the oyster production areas. And so the starfish, I think, are getting exposed to the glyphosate in the seagrass when they try to eat the oysters. And that's causing a chondroitin sulfate deficiency, which is messing up their external skeleton and causing this disease. Very, very disturbing. Okay, so glyphosate chelates manganese. That leads to anxiety because of the lactobacillus getting disrupted. And the glutamate and ammonia become toxic because you can't convert the glutamate to glutamine because of the glutamine synthetase depending upon the manganese. You have mitochondrial damage because of the manganese superoxide dismutase not working, and other enzymes involved in detoxifying the mitochondria. You have impaired bone development. You have osteoporosis and osteomalacia, soft bones, and you have impaired development of these perineuronal nets, which is going to cause excitability of the neurons. And so many of these are associated with autism. And then the effects on the coral and the starfish are also related. Okay, so we're close to done. I got several pictures here that are fun. This is just how can you protect yourself. I think the very most important thing you can do for your family is to go organic. My husband and I, when we're home, we buy only organic foods, everything. The beer, the wine, the spices, the cornstarch, the ketchup. I mean, everything is organic in our household. When I travel, every day I worry about setting back my health because I'm eating these poisonous foods. And someone here at the conference, I don't know what his name was, but he said he actually brings organic food in his suitcase when he travels. And I'm thinking maybe I better start doing that too. So it's really important. All of you, I would really urge you, not only go organic, but tell your friends to go organic too. Tell everybody you know. Because if we can get organic going, and we've had a 13% increase in organic just this one past year, 13% increase in the sales of organic foods. That's really exciting to me because if we could just keep that going up. In fact, the sales of organic food are going up right in step with glyphosate usage on corn and soy. No surprise there because people are realizing that the food is toxic and they're choosing to spend the extra money and eat the organic food. And, it's hard for you to realize that you should do that because you don't immediately feel the result. So you have to really get it into your brain that this stuff is toxic. Eat foods high in sulfur, and these are some examples. These are all very healthy foods in my view. You've got the cabbage family, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, onions and garlic. I think those are great choices for sulfur. These are the vegetables. And then you have all the seafood, the shrimp, the crab, the lobster, the oysters, and then you have the organ meats, which are always very dangerous to eat unless you eat them organic because they're going to be loaded with toxins. Cheese, cottage cheese, so fermented milk products. These are all, and eggs. Eggs are a great choice. You can get really good organic eggs, and they're not very expensive, and they're very, very healthy. They have not only sulfur, but all kinds of other nutrients as well. So these are good choices for the sulfur. And then manganese is the other one you need to worry about, which no one's thinking about. And these are the foods that are good in manganese. Tofu, but you have to be very careful that it's organic. And fish, and kale, and spinach, and oysters again. So oysters are good for both manganese and sulfur. And bread. So if you're avoiding gluten, you're going to miss out on the manganese in bread. And then seeds, various seeds, and I guess mostly seeds, and beans, seeds and beans. So these are all good sources of manganese. I didn't know this at all until I started getting worried about manganese. Hang out in the water at the seashore. I recommend this for everybody. This is such a healthy thing to be doing, especially if you're pregnant. You have the water actually has hydrogen sulfide gas, which you can absorb through your skin and make sulfate. The sunlight, of course, is always good for you. And the grounding, which is, I didn't talk about it, but I have in previous talks. If you are connected with the earth, you soak up the negative charge from the ground, and that is really, really important because negative charge is a really important part of staying healthy. And of course, the sulfates are going to hold on to that negative charge if you can produce them. And even the air, actually, near the ocean contains sulfur sources that you can absorb through the skin, or even breathing in. Escape to a sunny place in the winter, so you want to make sure during those long winter months that you get away from the winter cold. Give yourself a treat, spend the money, go down to Florida, hang out on the beach, 3 or 4 days in the middle of the winter. That will do a great deal to help you rejuvenate your vitamin D in those winter months. Epsom salts. I highly recommend Epsom salts. It's a very easy treatment. Magnesium sulfate. You can buy them at CVS or something. They're quite available in this sort of milk carton kind of container. Just dump some in the bath water and soak in it for maybe 20 minutes. And I just use sort of a small amount on a regular basis. So not like a treatment of a muscle ache or something, but just as a sort of maintenance supply of sulfate. This is a way to get sulfate into your body without having to fuss with getting it past the gut, which is tricky. And I didn't talk about that as much as I could have, but it's written up in some of my papers that the glyphosate makes it hard for the sulfate to get past the gut barrier. But you can escape all of that by soaking in Epsom salts. I'm not saying eating them, but just soaking in them in the bath. And that's like a hot springs, sulfur hot springs. Those are really healthy also if you are lucky enough to live near one. Take off the sunglasses and look at the blue sky, especially in the early morning. The early morning sun is really, really healthy. Or sunset and sunrise, that particular time of the day, the sun is really healthy. The lighting. And so you really want to make sure your eyes are getting exposure to light. That will keep your eyes healthy and also keep your pineal gland healthy because it'll be able to produce the sulfate and distribute that to the brain. And then, of course, the don'ts. Don't get a flu shot because it's not required. I wouldn't, necessarily recommend the other shots either, but at least this one, you should be able to say no to this one pretty easily. And, avoid aluminum, avoid high fructose corn syrup and all the sugars that are contaminated with glyphosate. Don't use sunscreen because not only does it prevent you from making the vitamin D, but it also disrupts the sulfate synthesis through the chemicals that are in it. And don't wear sunglasses. And then, of course, the most important thing, don't use Roundup. Don't buy it. Don't put it on your weeds. And don't buy the food that contains it. Okay, summary. The autism epidemic is caused by glyphosate working synergistically with aluminum and mercury and insufficient sun exposure to the skin and eyes. Diet depleted in micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. Our food is really very much depleted and we're not worrying about it. And that's in large part because of things like glyphosate that are messing up the ability of the plants to absorb the minerals. Glyphosate's chelation of metals is a core component of its toxicity. Disrupted gut bacteria leads to brain pathology. Aluminum, mercury, and manganese can account for many aspects of autism. Pineal gland plays an important role in brain dysfunction, and autism may be treatable through organic diet enriched with sulfur and manganese along with abundant sun exposure. Okay, and we're done. Thank you all for staying. Questions?
Is there anything that takes glyphosate out of your body, like any way to get rid of it if it's already there?
Yeah, and so, Monsanto says it doesn't bioaccumulate. And if you believe them, you just go organic and it will disappear. I think it's probably not that easy, in reality, but we don't know. I don't personally know how to no one has looked into that problem. No one's thought about the fact that it's there enough to think about how to get rid of it. So I don't know. Yeah?
I'd like to personally volunteer to be in your clinical trials for someone who is completely damaged with all of this my whole life, born in the 60s, so I have, everything that's bad. So I'm looking at all of these things. I'm wondering, for example, should I maybe be applying or ingesting DMSO to help with sulfur? Should I take melatonin supplements? I have horrible sleep problems. Should I take manganese? Are any of these things going to help? I'm looking at damage control, and I am now running an organic food bank. So yes, I'm going organic now, but I'm still suffering with a lot of.
How long have you been organic?
About a year and a half.
Year and a half. Have you seen any improvement?
I have seen some improvement.
Uh-huh.
I also take I got tested to find out that my progesterone and estrogen were at the levels of an 80-year-old woman.
Wow.
And so I'm taking just the progesterone, bioidentical.
Yeah,
I don't know
good.
if that's helped. I'm also taking right now chlorine dioxide and taking some of those baths, and that seems to be helping a little bit with the sleep. But like chronic memory problems, which have improved, but I'd like to help it along as much as possible before Alzheimer's really takes a hold of my brain.
Right. Right. Well, and you probably know about coconut oil, and I should have mentioned that. I have talked about that in the past, but coconut oil is really healthy coconut. All the coconut products.
Coconut oil.
Yes, coconut oil, coconut water, coconut flesh. Coconuts are really good food. And I didn't talk also, I have so many other things I could have talked about. It's always hard to know what to talk about, but I didn't talk about all the flavonoids and the polyphenols, there's things like curcumin and resveratrol. There's all these different nutrients that are that actually transport sulfate, it turns out. I think that's what gives them the benefit. Garlic. So I prefer to eat whole foods rather than supplements. I think supplements are sort of one single molecule in concentration, which is not a natural way to get it. So I prefer to eat foods that are rich in the things you need. And so I would say eating a lot of seafood and eating the eggs, so eating a sort of a high-fat diet. Saturated fat in particular is very healthy, which I know is not something they tell you, but I believe that's true. It can help your brain.
I've been a vegetarian for 2 years.
That's probably part of your problem.
I was considering converting to trying to eat meat.
Yes.
So you would recommend that then as well?
Certainly eggs, and if you can do eggs and cheese, sort of fermented dairy is really healthy. Yeah, eggs, and you could probably get by on eggs, and if you could eat, you don't eat dairy, you said. You don't? Yeah, okay, so.
Eggs, right, but not.
Just eggs, right?
I'm considering after today going with yogurt because it just seems like.
Yogurt would be good, yes. Organic, of course. And full fat, organic full fat yogurt, which is hard to find.
Familiar with DMSO at all?
Pardon?
Are you familiar with DMSO at all?
I am, DMSO, MSM, methylsulfonylmethane. That's a form of sulfur that is recommended as a supplement. I don't personally take it because I prefer to get my sulfur from foods. I love garlic, and I eat a lot of garlic and onion, and also seafood. But you wouldn't probably touch seafood, but seafood is a good choice for the sulfur. Question here?
Does reverse osmosis remove glyphosate from water?
I wish I knew. Does anyone here have a thought on that? I don't know. Hey, you have a question there? Minerals.
It removes everything. It's everything
You can put minerals in, but you got to get the chemicals out of the
Yeah.
glyphosate, and you got to get it out of the water.
Yeah, I know. It's,
You can buy mineral drops.
yeah, so heavily filter the water and then add minerals. That might be an interesting thing to do. Because certainly you don't want to filter out the minerals. Is it,
I just have a comment. I was just sort of looking on the web, and because I was curious of all the pesticides that are out there. On the National Pesticide Network that's put out
I know.
contain glyphosate.
Really, more than 750 different products contain glyphosate. That's what you're saying? Wow, that's amazing.
They're using it more and more evidently on fruits,
Yes.
flaxseed.
It's because they think it's safe.
Yeah, and that's what they say, of course. It's
Yeah, they say, oh yeah, it's a safe choice, so thank goodness we're using glyphosate. Yeah?
This is moving to the sunlight. How much is sufficient? I have two kids who are sensitive to the sun. They don't like it, and they don't like it hot.
So that's interesting that they don't like it and that they're sensitive, because I suspect that means, huh?
One has rhino.
Yeah, they might have a genetic problem with it, but I suspect too some kids are sensitive because of the toxic chemicals they've been exposed to. Because if you keep putting sunscreen, then eventually you can become impaired in your ability to use the sunlight correctly, and then you might become sensitive to it. So it might be hard to undo the damage of the sunscreen.
Well, I've avoided the paraben sunscreen, so I try to get
You get sort of the safe sunscreens.
I try, like
Yeah.
natural food,
That's better. That's better, yeah.
But how much would be enough for that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm a fanatic about the sun. I obsess on it. I mean, especially in the winter. If it's a bright, sunny day, I will take a break at lunchtime and take a walk for an hour. Because the winter it's hard to get enough sun. The summer I don't worry so much. I have a convertible. My cars are all convertibles. I have, I only drive a convertible car, and if the weather's at all, above 45 degrees, I've got the top down. I mean, I'm really trying to, because you're busy, you're indoors all the time. It's very difficult. I work at it. Yeah, the kids don't play outside these days. When I was a kid, everybody was outdoors. You come home from school, you go out and play with your friends, you come home at 6 o'clock for dinner. I mean, that's what we used to do, and they don't do that these days. They're all inside on their computers, Yeah?
Yeah, I had a different question, but I first piggybacking on hers, because in our family, for my son, we have one son, all four of his grandparents had skin cancer. And his great-grandfather died at 42.
Oh, boy.
So, and then my father-in-law has had melanoma, my mother-in-law has had skin cancer since she was in her 30s, she worked with my dad, like all of them. So, like when you were talking about the son, I'm like,
Right.
because we live in a red-headed fair skin.
You're right.
So I do also try and get only the healthier sunscreen.
Right.
I understand the vitamin D deficiency part too, but
It's
difficult.
It's curious that if you look at, I have a book, a really excellent book, written by Elizabeth Plourde called Sunscreen: Biohazard. She has several hundred references in this book. And one of the things she points out is that since 1970, when we started becoming obsessed on using sunscreen to protect from the sun, the rate of melanoma cancer has gone up by 2 or 3% every year, right in step with the increased use of sunscreen. I mean, just like glyphosate and autism, it's a very good match. The more sunscreen, the more skin cancer. So I personally think the sunscreen could be causing the skin cancer because it's disrupting your ability to do your natural protection. And that means every time you're not using the sunscreen, you're in danger. So it's really insidious. I personally don't like sunscreen.
But the question that I had was about, have they done any, and I was like 10 minutes late, so I don't know if you mentioned this at the beginning, in any studies. Have they done studies on the rates of autism in children who actually are born on farms that grow these crops that you
No, they haven't. I mean, we don't have that direct connection. The direct connection is indirect by just looking at these growth of the use of glyphosate on the soy, on the core crops of the processed food industry, which correlates very, very strongly with autism, the 0.99 Pearson correlation coefficient. But that's a very vague number because you're not actually proving that it's causing it.
I need to find that out, like if there's a really big increase there.
Question? Get a what? Get what out of it? Aluminum out of the pineal gland. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think if you use chelation therapy, it's pretty much pulling it out of the gut. And as you pull it out of the gut, then that makes it lower in the blood. And if it's lower in the blood, then it might move the other direction and get out. But I think it's very difficult to get aluminum out of the brain. That's what I've heard. Once it's there, it's very difficult to get it out.
And how do you measure sulfate? You measure that in blood. How do you measure sulfate?
How do you measure it? Yeah, you can measure sulfate levels in the blood and in the urine. And they've done that for autism and shown that it's low in the blood and high in the urine.
Okay, and then I have one question. Because I tried melatonin on my daughter and it didn't work. What does that indicate?
You took melatonin, it didn't help you sleep?
Yeah, it helped her sleep and it did not work. So I'm wondering, what does that indicate?
I don't know. I personally would not recommend taking melatonin. I would recommend getting outside, especially in the morning, getting outside and getting sunlight exposure to your eyes in the morning. And that will encourage your pineal gland to make the melatonin that you need. And if you take melatonin, then your body gets confused because the pineal gland kind of takes a vacation. It's like, oh, fine, someone else is providing this, I don't need to. And then you're stuck with having to provide it. The pineal gland knows how to provide it when you need it. So you really want to get it working again. And even possibly exposing it to the sun, if you can make the sulfate, I think it will help it to heal. And that might even help you to get rid of the aluminum by making it healthy again with the sulfates. That's it? I think we're over time. Oh, okay. You want
I never heard of manganese deficiency linked with glutamate, gluten, ammonia, lactobacillus. My kids have problems with every one of those indicators.
Wow.
Maybe I need to supplement or give manganese food. Do you think that by increasing the manganese levels that all those things could help?
I would expect so, and I would encourage to do it through food because it's very tricky to take an isolated mineral. You can overdose, you know. If you just take it as a concentrated pill, I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend trying to get them to eat the foods that contain the manganese.
I think maybe our started my daughter was diagnosed with celiac disease.
Uh-huh.
We cut out a lot of grain.
Yeah, so you lost that big one because that one's an easy one if you can eat bread. I mean, that's unfortunate. But you can do pine nuts or macadamia nuts. I mean, those are nuts and seeds. Blueberries, you're right, blueberries. So find something she likes and feed her tons of it. That's what I would do. Because you'll have all the other nutrients that go with the manganese, so the body will know how to absorb it correctly. Otherwise, it could be toxic if you just take it as a pill. It's very tricky to get, because you only need it in small amounts. But you certainly need it, you know. Yeah, Brazil nuts, yeah. Yeah, good. Can someone, she answered your question? You're toxic? I didn't quite hear the question, but I guess maybe it's been answered, right?
Are there copies of your slides anywhere? The copies of the slides?
Oh, my slides. Yes, I should have put them up on the web before, and I haven't yet, but I will as soon as I get back. And it'll be on my web. My webpage also has a whole bunch of other slides, so you can see some of my other people.ccel.mit.edu/Seneff. Write that down. Search my name. If you can remember Seneff even. Seneff is an unusual name. I have a bunch of videos and radio interviews and papers and stuff you could find if you just type my name into a search engine. Seneff.